Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. I don't usually take long road trips, but this one was unavoidable. My sister was getting married in Houston, and I couldn't afford a plane ticket, so I decided to drive from El Paso. It was supposed to be simple, a straight shot across Texas with some podcasts and snacks to keep me company. I planned the trip so most of the driving would be during daylight, but delays at work meant I ended up leaving much later than expected. By the time I was halfway through, it was close to midnight. The stretch of highway I was on was dark, with barely any cars around. My headlights cut through the emptiness, and the occasional sign for a gas station or diner was the only thing breaking the monotony. I wasn't nervous at first. I even thought it was kind of peaceful. But then I noticed a car behind me. It wasn't unusual to see another vehicle on the road, of course, but this one gave me a weird feeling. It was a black sedan, its headlights fixed on me like it was following too closely. I figured it was just some impatient driver and decided to let it pass. I slowed down slightly and moved to the side, but the car didn't pass. It stayed right behind me, matching my speed. I brushed it off, telling myself not to overthink. Maybe they were just being cautious in the dark. But as the miles stretched on, the car didn't back off. I took a random exit to see if they were just coincidentally going the same way, but they followed me off the highway. That was when my heart started to pound. I turned onto a smaller road, then another, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. But no matter which way I went, the car stayed with me. Its headlights bore into my rearview mirror like they were taunting me. I pulled into a gas station, hoping they'd just drive by and prove I was imagining things. Instead, they pulled in behind me, parking a few spaces away. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but the silhouette of someone sitting behind the wheel was unmistakable. My hands were shaking as I pretended to check my phone, waiting to see if they'd make a move. After a few tense minutes, they pulled out of the lot and drove off. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling ridiculous for getting so worked up. Still, I decided to wait another 10 minutes just to be safe. When I finally got back on the road, I felt a little calmer. But that didn't last long. Not 5 minutes later, I saw those same headlights in my mirror. The black sedan was back. This time it felt deliberate. My stomach dropped as I realized this wasn't a coincidence. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Hi, there's a car following me. It wasn't like they'd done anything illegal yet. I tried to focus on driving, keeping my speed steady and my hands tight on the wheel. But the more I tried to stay calm, the more I felt the weight of their presence behind me. I spotted a sign for a rest stop and decided to pull in. My plan was to park near other cars, or maybe even go inside if there were people around. As I pulled into the lot, I scanned for any signs of life. It was completely empty. I hesitated, unsure if stopping was the right move. The sedan slowed down but didn't pull in. It rolled past the rest stop and disappeared down the road. I exhaled, telling myself I must have been imagining things. Maybe they were just heading the same way after all. But as I merged back onto the highway, I saw them again. This time, they didn't bother keeping their distance. They sped up, closing the gap between us until they were practically tailgating me. My throat felt tight, and my hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel. I pressed down on the gas, trying to put some distance between us, but they matched my speed. The road was empty except for the two of us, and the sense of isolation made everything worse. I switched lanes abruptly, but they followed. When I took another random exit, they did the same. I was panicking now. I had no idea where I was or where to go. I just needed to get away. I turned onto a winding back road, hoping the tight curves would give me a chance to lose them. But instead of falling back, they got even closer. Their headlights filled my mirrors, blinding me, and their engine roared like they were daring me to do something. Then, out of nowhere, they slammed into the back of my car. The impact jolted me forward, and I barely kept control of the wheel. My heart was racing as I realized they weren't just following me, they were trying to run me off the road. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, my car struggling to pick up speed on the uneven road. They hit me again, harder this time, and I could feel the back of my car swerving. Panic took over as I spotted a turn up ahead and yanked the wheel, hoping to shake them, but they stayed with me, their headlights glaring like twin suns. My tires skidded on loose gravel and I felt the car start to slide. Before I could regain control, they rammed me one last time, sending me off the road and into a ditch. The impact knocked the wind out of me. My ears were ringing, and my head was spinning as I tried to process what just happened. I could hear the crunch of gravel as the other car stopped. My hands fumbled with the seatbelt, adrenaline surging as I struggled to think straight. The driver's door of the sedan opened, and a man stepped out. He was holding a crowbar. My entire body froze as I saw the man step closer, the crowbar glinting faintly in the moonlight. He didn't say anything. He didn't shout or threaten me. He just walked, deliberate, steady, like he had all the time in the world. I tried to move, but my limbs felt like they were made of lead. My brain was screaming at me to do something, but fear had me locked in place. By the time I finally got my seatbelt undone, he was only a few feet away. I scrambled to grab my phone, but it had flown off the passenger seat in the crash. Frantically, I searched the floor, but it was too dark to see. My hands brushed against something cold, my keys, and I gripped them tightly, thinking they might be the only weapon I had. The man reached my window and raised the crowbar. I ducked just in time as the glass shattered, shards raining down on me. He didn't hesitate, reaching through the broken window to unlock the door. I kicked at his arm, but it barely fazed him. His strength was terrifying, like he was running on pure adrenaline. As he yanked the door open, I threw the keys at his face. It was a pathetic move, but it gave me just enough time to shove the door with all my weight. It slammed into him, and I bolted out the passenger side, tripping over the uneven ground as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. Behind me, I heard him cursing, his heavy footsteps crunching the gravel as he chased after me. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were giving out, but I couldn't stop. The open road was too far away, and there was nothing but darkness in every direction. I spotted a cluster of trees up ahead and veered toward them, hoping they'd give me some kind of cover. I ducked behind the thickest trunk I could find, pressing my back against the rough bark as I tried to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. For a moment, everything was silent. I strained my ears, trying to pick up on his movements, but all I could hear was the wind rustling through the branches. Then, a voice. Low, calm, and too close. "You can't hide forever." I clapped a hand over my mouth, tears streaming down my face as I tried to stifle my breathing. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, circling the trees. He was toying with me, dragging out the moment like it was a game. I glanced around desperately, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a jagged branch lying on the ground a few feet away. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. When his footsteps moved further away, I made a break for it, grabbing the branch and sprinting toward the road. My legs felt like they were on fire, but the thought of him catching me was enough to keep me moving. I could see the faint glow of headlights in the distance. Another car, maybe my only chance at help. I waved my arms frantically, screaming at the top of my lungs. The car slowed down, and relief flooded through me. But just as it pulled over, I heard him behind me. I turned just in time to see him lunging at me, the crowbar raised high. Without thinking, I swung the branch as hard as I could. It connected with his shoulder, and he stumbled back with a grunt. The driver of the stopped car jumped out, a middle-aged man with a baseball bat in hand. He shouted something I couldn't make out, his voice drowned out by the blood pounding in my ears. The man with the crowbar hesitated for a moment before turning and running back toward his car. I collapsed onto the ground, shaking uncontrollably as the other driver called the police. When the cops arrived, the man was long gone. They searched the area but didn't find much, just tire tracks and the shattered remains of my car window. To this day, I don't know who he was or why he targeted me. The police said it might have been a carjacking gone wrong, but I don't buy it. He didn't seem interested in my car or anything else. He just wanted to hurt me. Now, I can't drive at night without checking my mirrors every few seconds. Every pair of headlights feels like a threat, and every unfamiliar car feels like it's following me. I don't think that fear will ever go away. This happened a couple of years ago during a road trip I took through Texas. I was driving from Houston to El Paso, and it was one of those stretches of highway where the towns were few and far between. You know, those places where you can drive for miles and not see a single building, just endless road and open land. The kind of place where if you needed help, you'd be screwed if someone didn't stop. Anyway, it was late afternoon, maybe around 4:30 or 5 p.m., and the sun was starting to dip low. I had been driving for hours straight and hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes. That's when I saw him. A guy standing on the shoulder of the road, waving his arms at me as I approached. He was next to an older-looking sedan with the hood popped open. The car was tilted slightly, like it might have had a flat tire or something. At first, I wasn't sure if I should stop. I mean, I've heard the stories, and we all know the advice, don't stop for strangers. But he looked normal. Just a regular guy, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, nothing weird or sketchy about him. Plus, it was broad daylight, and I figured if I were in his position, I'd want someone to stop and help me too. So, I slowed down and pulled over a little ahead of his car. I left the engine running because, well, you never know. He jogged up to my passenger side window, and I cracked it open just enough to hear him, but not enough for him to reach in. "Hey man, thanks for stopping," he said, a little out of breath. "My car broke down and my phone's dead. I've been trying to flag someone down for over an hour. Do you think you could give me a ride to the next gas station? Or at least let me use your phone to call for help?" He sounded genuine, and he looked frustrated, not in a crazy way, but in that way you get when nothing's going right. Still, something about the whole thing felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, though. Maybe it was how isolated we were. Maybe it was just my gut telling me to be careful. I hesitated for a second and then said, "Yeah, I can call someone for you. Where's the nearest gas station?" "There's one about 15 miles up the road," he said, looking relieved. "But it's not on the main highway. You gotta take a turnoff about 5 miles ahead. I can show you where it is." That set off a little alarm in my head. Why would I need to take a turnoff? Why couldn't he just tell me the name of the gas station and I'd call them or something? Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. "All right, I can call them," I said, pulling out my phone. "That's the thing," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "I don't know their number. I was just going to ride with you and we could get there together." Now I was feeling uneasy. He didn't seem aggressive or anything, but the situation was starting to feel weird. I told him I wasn't comfortable giving rides to strangers, especially in such a remote area. He didn't argue, but his face changed a little. It was subtle, like he was trying to hide his disappointment, or maybe it was annoyance. "All right, man," he said after a pause. I get it. Do you think you could at least give me some water or something? I've been out here a while, and it's pretty hot. That seemed reasonable enough. I had a couple of water bottles in the back seat, so I nodded and said, "Yeah, hang on." I reached back to grab one, keeping my eyes on him as much as I could. That's when I noticed he had stepped closer to the car like he was trying to see inside. My heart started pounding a little, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I handed him the bottle through the cracked window. "Thanks," he said, unscrewing the cap and taking a long drink. Then he wiped up his mouth with the back of his hand and leaned a little closer to the window. "You sure you can't give me a ride? It'd really help me out." I shook my head. "Sorry, man. I can't." For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me, and that's when the vibe shifted completely. His expression went from frustrated to something else. I don't know how to describe it, but it made my stomach drop. "All right," he said finally, stepping back. "Thanks for the water." I nodded and started to roll the window up, but before I could, he lunged forward and grabbed the handle of the door. "Hey, what the hell?" I shouted, fumbling to lock the doors, but it was too late. He yanked the door open, and before I could react, he had a knife in his hand. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to make me freeze. "Hand over your wallet and your car keys," he said, his voice low and steady. I was shaking so hard I could barely think. I wanted to fight back, to do something, but all I could do was stare at the blade and nod. I fumbled to get my wallet out of my pocket and tossed it to him. Then I grabbed the keys from the ignition and handed them over too. "Get out of the car," he said, motioning with the knife. At that point, I was sure he was going to take the car and leave me stranded. But instead of climbing in, he just stood there, staring at me like he was deciding what to do next. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said finally, though his grip on the knife didn't loosen. "Just walk down the road and don't look back." I didn't need to be told twice. I started walking, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him getting into the car and then the sound of the engine starting. But instead of driving off, he just sat there for a moment, watching me through the rearview mirror. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the car pull away. I kept walking for at least a mile before I dared to look back. When I did, the road behind me was empty. It took hours before I finally flagged down another car, and even then, I was terrified they might be another scammer. I eventually got to a gas station and called the cops, but they never found the guy. He was just gone, along with my car and everything in it. To this day, I can't stop thinking about how close I came to something worse happening. If I hadn't handed over the keys, who knows what he might have done. I decided to camp out in my car for the night at a roadside pull-off in a quiet area. I was in Texas, somewhere in the middle of nowhere between Dallas and El Paso. I'd been driving for hours, and the thought of another 2 or 3 before I hit a proper town made my head throb. The stretch of road was so empty it felt like I hadn't seen another car in ages, and the darkness out here wasn't the kind you get in the city. It was absolute. No streetlights, no houses, nothing but my headlights cutting through the black. I found this pull-off around 10 p.m., a little gravel lot next to the road with nothing around except some scrubby bushes and trees. It wasn't much, but I figured it was good enough. I'd done this before on road trips, saved some money on motels by sleeping in the car. I parked near the edge of the lot where the gravel gave way to dirt and bushes. I locked the doors, cracked the windows just a bit for air, and reclined my seat. The quiet out there was unsettling, but I tried to tell myself it was peaceful. No cars roaring by, no people yelling, just crickets chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I scrolled on my phone for a while, but there was no signal, so I gave up and tried to sleep. It took a while. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something, a faint crunch of gravel, a distant snap of a twig. I kept telling myself it was animals. I'd seen a deer earlier that day and plenty of rabbits darting across the road. Out here, that's all it could be, right? But the sounds didn't feel random. It was the pattern that got me. Crunch, pause, like footsteps. I sat up, peering out the window. It was pitch black outside, and my car's dome light didn't help. All it did was reflect my face back at me. I turned it off and just stared into the dark. Nothing. I didn't see anything, and after a while, I started to feel stupid for getting spooked. I laid back down and told myself to quit overthinking. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. Closer this time. A deliberate crunch. It sounded like someone stepping on the gravel just a few feet from my car. My stomach dropped. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever or whatever was out there could probably hear it. I stayed completely still, listening, my ears straining for anything. Another crunch, then silence. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to turn the car on and make myself a target if someone was out there, but I also didn't want to stay and risk whatever this was. I reached for my phone, but there was still no signal. Great. I decided to wait it out. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe some animal really was just wandering by. I kept telling myself that, but I couldn't relax. Every few minutes I'd hear another sound. Gravel shifting, leaves rustling, the faintest scrape of something against the side of the car. I wanted to turn the engine on and get the hell out of there, but I was frozen. Then the worst thing happened. My car rocked. Just a little, but enough to make my breath catch. It felt like something or someone was pressing against the back corner. I sat up, my eyes darting to the windows, but I couldn't see a thing. It was so dark, I couldn't even make out the shapes of the bushes anymore. I felt trapped, like the car was a cage. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of metal against metal, right by the driver's side door. It was faint at first, but then it got louder, a scraping, prying sound. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew what it was. Someone was trying to get in. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I turned the car on, and the headlights lit up the gravel lot. For a split second, I saw him, a man crouched by my door, holding a crowbar. His face was pale and dirty, and his eyes locked onto mine as soon as the lights hit him. I didn't think. I just threw the car into reverse and floored it. Gravel sprayed everywhere as I backed out, and the man stumbled, but he didn't fall. He stood there, watching as I sped off, the crowbar dangling from his hand. I didn't stop driving until I hit the next town, where I found a gas station with lights and people. I parked under a streetlight and sat there for what felt like forever, trying to calm down. I couldn't believe what had just happened. If I hadn't woken up when I did, I don't know what he would have done. Now, every time I pass one of those roadside pull-offs, I feel sick to my stomach. I'll never sleep in my car again. Never. I was on a road trip from Austin to El Paso, trying to make it as far as I could before pulling into some cheap motel for the night. I don't usually like driving at night, but the daytime heat had been brutal and the AC in my car wasn't great. I figured a few extra hours in the cooler evening air wouldn't hurt. Besides, I had the road mostly to myself, a rare thing in Texas. It was one of those long, lonely stretches of highway where you could drive for miles without seeing another car. Just you, the road, and the occasional distant glow of a ranch light. The night was pitch black, the kind where even the stars seemed to be swallowed up by the emptiness. My headlights were the only thing keeping the world visible. I was just cruising along, listening to some random podcast I barely paid attention to, when I saw something up ahead. At first, it looked like nothing, just some flickering lights. As I got closer, I realized it was a car on the shoulder of the road, its hazard lights flashing. And then I saw him, a man lying on the ground right next to the car. My first thought was that it was a medical emergency. Maybe he'd had a heart attack or fainted while driving. His car was still there, one door slightly ajar, but he wasn't moving. It didn't look like there'd been an accident. No skid marks or damage to the car. I slowed down and pulled over about 20 feet behind the vehicle. My heart was racing a little, and I hesitated. I've always been told to be cautious in situations like this, but the guy looked like he really needed help. His clothes were dirty, like he'd been lying there for a while, and his arms were splayed out unnaturally. I rolled down my window halfway. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" No response. "Sir, do you need help?" I called out louder. Still nothing. I turned off my podcast and just sat there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. A part of me wanted to just drive off. It didn't feel right. None of it did. But what if the guy was dying or something? I couldn't just leave him there. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the signal was weak. Typical middle of nowhere Texas. The call wouldn't go through. "All right, fine," I muttered to myself. I grabbed the small flashlight I keep in my glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The air was heavy and warm, and the silence was suffocating. Even the usual hum of crickets and night sounds seemed absent. As I walked closer, I kept the flashlight pointed at the man. He still wasn't moving, and the closer I got, the thought about the whole situation. Something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "Hey man, you okay? Can you hear me?" I asked again, my voice shaking slightly. And that's when I saw it. Movement. Not from him, but from the darkness beyond the car. Another man stepped out from the shadows, right near the edge of the road. My stomach dropped. "Need some help, friend?" the man said, his voice low and gravelly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I hadn't even seen him there. "No, I'm good," I replied quickly, taking a step back. The man smirked. "Doesn't look like it. You're real kind to stop like this." I started backing up toward my car, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I tried to keep my eyes on both of them, the guy lying on the ground and the one standing in front of me, but it was hard. "Hey, I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice cracking. "I thought someone needed help, that's all." "Oh, we do," the man said, taking a step closer. His hand reached behind his back, and I knew then I'd made a mistake. I bolted. I didn't even think. I just turned and ran for my car, fumbling for my keys as I heard the man shout behind me. My flashlight fell out of my hand, but I didn't stop. I barely made it into the driver's seat when I heard footsteps pounding toward me. I slammed the door shut and hit the lock button just as the man reached the car. He yanked on the handle, his face inches from mine through the window. "Get out!" he yelled, slamming his fist against the glass. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed up onto the highway. The other man, the one who'd been lying on the ground, was on his feet now, running toward me. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next. I floored it, my heart racing as I sped down the road. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing in the middle of the highway, watching me drive away. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and called the police. They sent someone out to check, but by the time they got there, the car and the men were gone. The officer I spoke to didn't seem surprised. He told me this kind of thing happens more often than people think. "You're lucky you got away," he said. Lucky doesn't even begin to cover it. I still think about that night every time I drive through Texas. Now, I don't stop for anyone, no matter what. I was on a road trip through Texas, driving from El Paso to Austin. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and the stretch of road I was on was completely empty. No streetlights, no other cars, just endless darkness and the occasional reflectors on the side of the road. I had been driving for hours and my fuel gauge was nearing empty, so when I saw a flickering sign for a gas station up ahead, I felt a wave of relief. The gas station looked like something out of an old movie. It was small, rundown, and lit by a single buzzing fluorescent light. The place felt eerie right away. There was only one other car in the lot, an old, beat-up truck with rusted edges. I pulled up to the pump and got out to fill my tank. As I was standing there, I noticed a man leaning against the wall near the entrance. He was wearing a tattered flannel shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He looked rough, like someone who'd been out here for a while. At first, I tried to ignore him, focusing on the pump and glancing at my phone, but then I heard him call out, "Hey man, you headed east?" I froze for a second before looking over at him. His voice was deep, and there was something off about the way he spoke, like he was trying to sound casual, but it didn't quite come off that way. "Yeah," I replied, hesitant. "You think you could give me a ride? My truck's busted, and I've been stuck here for hours. Just need to get to the next town." I didn't answer right away. Something about him made me uneasy, but I also felt bad. This place really was in the middle of nowhere, and if he'd been stuck here all night, that sucked. Where's the next town?" I asked, trying to buy myself some time to think. "Just about 20 miles up the road," he said. "Shouldn't take more than 30 minutes." I looked around. The gas station attendant, if there even was one, wasn't visible. It was just me, the man, and the quiet hum of the gas pump. Against my better judgment, I agreed. "All right, sure," I said. His face didn't light up the way I thought it would. He just nodded and grabbed a duffel bag that had been sitting by his feet. He climbed into the passenger seat of my car without saying another word. The moment he got in, the atmosphere changed. He smelled like sweat and smoke, and the air in the car felt heavier. I tried to make small talk as we pulled out of the gas station, but he mostly gave short one-word answers. He said his name was Joe, but I didn't believe him. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed he kept shifting in his seat, like he couldn't get comfortable. He had his hands in his lap, fidgeting with something. I couldn't see what it was, but it made me nervous. "So what were you doing out there?" I asked, trying to keep the mood light. "Just passing through," he said, like not looking at me. Passing through to where? I wanted to ask, but I kept my mouth shut. We drove in silence for a while. The road was pitch black, and my headlights barely cut through the darkness. I felt like we were the only two people left in the world. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You can pull off up there. There's a shortcut I know that'll get me where I need to go." My stomach dropped. I didn't see any turn off or road up ahead, just more empty highway. "I'd rather stay on the main road," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to look at me for the first time since he'd gotten in the car. His eyes were dark, and there was something in them that made my skin crawl. I said, "Pull off up there," he repeated, his voice harder this time. That's when I saw it. He pulled a knife out of his jacket and held it low, just out of my direct line of sight. He wasn't waving it around or pointing it at me, but the threat was clear. "Take the next turn," he said. I felt like my heart was going to explode. My hands were sweating, and I could barely keep a grip on the steering wheel. I nodded and slowed down, pretending to look for the turn he was talking about. The road was completely empty, and I couldn't see any signs of civilization ahead. If I turned off, I knew I wouldn't come back. I had to think fast. "I need to stop and take a leak," I said, trying to sound casual. "Been holding it for a while." He stared at me for a long moment before nodding. "Make it quick." I pulled the car over to the side of the road and put it in park. My mind was racing. As I got out, I grabbed my phone from the cup holder and slipped it into my pocket. I pretended to walk toward the bushes, but as soon as I was out of his line of sight, I took off running into the darkness. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't care. Eventually, I found a small ditch and crouched down, trying to catch my breath. I called 911 and gave them my location as best as I could. When the police arrived about 30 minutes later, my car was gone. So was the man. They found the car a few hours later, abandoned in a field a few miles away. The duffel bag he'd been carrying was still inside. It was full of zip ties, duct tape, and a roll of plastic sheeting. To this day, I don't know what his plan was, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have made it out alive if I hadn't run when I did. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.